October 17th, 1935. Title Toys 47 a.m. Frank Costello was sitting in his silk pajamas, reading financial reports from his Brooklyn operations. When the phone rang, 3 rings, then silence. 3 more rings, then silence. This wasn't random, this was a code. Someone wanted to talk, someone important enough to know his private line, someone dangerous enough to call at this hour. Costello picked up on the 6th ring. He didn't say hello, he just listened. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, with just a hint of southern warmth that made it somehow more unsettling than any threat could be. Mr. Costello, this is Bumpy Johnson. I believe we need to discuss your expansion plans for Harlem. What Frank Costello didn't know was that this single conversation would change the balance of power in New York forever. Not through violence, not through war, through something far more dangerous, strategic intelligence. But to understand why this phone call sent shockwaves through the Italian crime families, you need to understand what was happening in Harlem in 1935. The Great Depression had hit black communities harder than anywhere else. Unemployment was over 50%. People were desperate, and desperate people gamble. The numbers racket was everything. For a nickel, you could bet on a 3-digit number. If it hit, you won 35 times your bet. That nickel could become one. For families surviving on $8 a week, that wasn't just money, that was hope. And hope, in 1935 Harlem, was a multi-million-dollar industry. The Italian families had been watching this money flow for years. Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, they saw Harlem as untapped territory, rich in cash, poor in organization, ripe for conquest. They'd already moved into East Harlem, the Italian section. Now they wanted the rest. But there was a problem. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy to those who knew him, and by 1935, everyone in Harlem knew him. Bumpy wasn't just another street enforcer. He was something the Italians hadn't encountered before. He was educated, had taught himself to read Shakespeare and Marcus Aurelius during his prison years. He was strategic, understood that real power came from community loyalty, not just fear. And he was connected, had relationships that crossed racial lines in ways that seemed impossible in segregated America. Most importantly, Bumpy understood something that the Italian families consistently underestimated. Information was more powerful than intimidation. 3 weeks before that phone call, Frank Costello had held a meeting in the back room of Rao's restaurant on 1114th Street. Present were representatives from all 5 families. The topic, the Harlem expansion. Gentlemen, Costello had said, spreading a hand-drawn map of Manhattan across the table, we're leaving money on the table. Harlem generates more numbers revenue than Brooklyn and the Bronx combined. And what do we get? Nothing. Carlo Gambino leaned forward. What about the local? They won't just step aside. Costello smiled. The locals are disorganized. No central authority. We move in systematically, buy out the small operators, eliminate the ones who refuse. 6 months, and Harlem is ours. What none of them knew was that the waiter refilling their wine glasses was Jerome Washington, a 23-year-old college student working his way through Columbia University. Jerome had been recruited by Bumpy 2 years earlier. Not as a criminal, but as an observer, someone who could move through spaces where other people wouldn't notice him. Jerome had exceptional hearing and an even more exceptional memory. By the time he left Rao's that night, he'd memorized every detail of the Italian family's expansion plan, the timeline, the target location, the enforcement strategy, everything. Within 6 hours, Jerome was sitting in Bumpy's office above Small's Paradise nightclub, recounting every word he'd heard. Bumpy listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a leather journal he kept for important information. They're planning to move on November 1st, Jerome concluded, starting with the policy banks on 25th Street. Bumpy was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes. Then he did something that surprised Jerome. He smiled. 3 weeks, Bumpy said quietly. They've given us 3 weeks to prepare. But Bumpy wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for something much more sophisticated. He was preparing to make the Italian families withdraw voluntarily. The first phase of Bumpy's strategy was intelligence gathering. If the Italians knew his operations, he needed to know theirs, but not just their Harlem plans, everything. Their financial structures, their political connections, their family relationships, their weaknesses. Bumpy had cultivated a network of informants that stretched far beyond Harlem. Doormen at expensive hotels, telephone operators, bank clerks, parking attendants outside Italian social clubs, people who were invisible to powerful men, but saw everything. Within a week, Bumpy had detailed intelligence on Frank Costello's operations. He knew that Costello was skimming money from his own family's slot machine operations. He knew about Costello's secret meetings with FBI agent Joe Valachi, who was feeding him information about federal investigations. He knew that Costello's wife was having an affair with their family doctor, and that Costello was planning to eliminate the doctor as soon as he discovered the relationship. But most importantly, Bumpy knew about Costello's greatest vulnerability: his political connections. Frank Costello had spent years building relationships with New York politicians, judges, police commissioners, city councilmen. These relationships were based on mutual benefit. Costello provided campaign funding and vote delivery. The politicians provided protection and information. The crown jewel of Costello's political network was Judge Samuel Seabury, who was leading a highly publicized corruption investigation in New York City government. What the public didn't know was that Judge Seabury was being paid $50,000 a year by Costello to ensure that certain names never came up in his investigation. If this information became public, it wouldn't just destroy Judge Seabury. It would bring down a dozen other politicians and expose the entire corruption network that protected Costello's operations. The Italian families would lose their political shield, making them vulnerable to federal prosecution. This was Bumpy's leverage, not violence, information. The second phase was psychological warfare. Starting October 10th, strange things began happening to key members of the Italian families. Nothing violent, nothing that could be traced. Just unsettling incidents. Tony Bender, one of Costello's lieutenants, found his personal mail being delivered to the wrong address. When he complained to the post office, they had no record of any change. But somehow, Bumpy Johnson's organization was reading Tony's correspondence before forwarding it to him. Salvatore Maranzano discovered that someone had been sitting in his assigned queue at St. Patrick's Cathedral every Sunday for 2 weeks. The same person, a well-dressed black man who nodded politely when Maranzano arrived, then quietly left. The message was clear: "We know where you worship, where you find peace. We can be there too." Most unsettling of all, several Italian family members received copies of their own family photographs in the mail. Pictures taken at private family gatherings, wedding photos, children's birthday parties. No threats, no demands, just the photos, with a simple note: "Beautiful family." The psychological impact was devastating. These men, who controlled vast criminal enterprises through intimidation, were being intimidated themselves, and they couldn't figure out how. But the most sophisticated element of Bumpy's strategy was disinformation. Through his network, Bumpy began feeding carefully crafted false information to the Italian families, information designed to make them question each other's loyalty and competence. Frank Costello received an anonymous tip that Lucky Luciano was planning to eliminate him and take over his operations. Lucky Luciano received information suggesting that Costello was cooperating with federal investigators. Carlo Gambino was told that both Costello and Luciano were planning to merge their families and cut him out entirely. None of this was true, but in the paranoid world of organized crime, truth mattered less than perception. The Italian families began watching each other more carefully than they were watching Harlem. By October 15th, the 5 families were so focused on internal suspicions that their Harlem expansion plan had been postponed twice. But Bumpy knew this wouldn't last. Eventually, they would resolve their differences and refocus on their original target. That's when Bumpy made his decision. It was time for the phone call. October 17th, 2:47 a.m. Bumpy dialed Frank Costello's private number from a payphone on 105th Street. He'd chosen this time deliberately, late enough to be unsettling, early enough that Costello would be alone. "Mr. Costello, this is Bumpy Johnson. I believe we need to discuss your expansion plans for Harlem." There was a long silence on the other end. When Costello finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "October 3rd, Bumpy said calmly. "Back room of Rao's restaurant. You, representatives from all 5 families, discussing the systematic takeover of Harlem's numbers operations. Starting November 1st, with the policy banks on 100.
Another silence. Longer this time. "You have our attention," Costello said finally. "Good, 'cause I have a proposal. One conversation, just you and me. After that you can proceed with your plans if you choose. But I think you'll find it more profitable to pursue opportunities elsewhere. And if I refuse this conversation," Bumpy's voice remained perfectly calm, "then tomorrow morning, Judge Samuel Seabury will receive a very interesting package. Photographs of you and the judge at the Stork Club last month. Bank records showing $50,000 in payments to his personal account. Recordings of conversations where you discuss which investigations to suppress." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank Costello understood exactly what was being offered. A choice voluntary withdrawal from Harlem. or the complete destruction of his political protection network. Where? Costello asked. Central Park, the bench by the reservoir. Tomorrow night, 11 p.m. Come alone. Bumpy hung up without waiting for a response. October 18th, 11 p.m. Central Park was shrouded in fog, the kind of thick October mist that made even familiar landmarks seem mysterious and threatening. Frank Costello arrived exactly on time, wearing an expensive overcoat and carrying a briefcase. Bumpy was already there, sitting on the bench, reading a newspaper by the light of a nearby lamppost. He looked up as Costello approached. "Thank you for coming," Bumpy said, folding his newspaper. "Please, sit." For the next 90 minutes, the two most powerful crime leaders in New York had a conversation that would reshape the city's criminal landscape. Bumpy didn't make threats. He didn't need to. Instead, he presented Frank Costello with a comprehensive analysis of why the Harlem expansion was a strategic mistake. "You see Harlem as unclaimed territory," Bumpy explained. "But it's not unclaimed. It's organized differently than you're accustomed to. The loyalty structures, the information networks, the community relationships, they're all there. You just don't recognize them, because they don't look like your structures." He pulled out a folder and handed it to Costello. Inside were detailed financial projections showing the cost of establishing and maintaining operations in Harlem versus the potential profits. "Your analysis assumes minimal resistance," Bumpy continued. "But resistance isn't minimal, it's total, and it's sustainable. We're not just protecting territory, we're protecting community. People will fight for that in ways they won't fight for business interests." Costello studied the numbers. Even accounting for Bumpy's bias, the mathematics were sobering. The cost of a sustained conflict in Harlem would exceed potential profits for at least 3 years. "Furthermore," Bumpy said, "your expansion into Harlem brings unwanted federal attention. Black neighborhoods are already under surveillance. Adding Italian crime family presence creates a composite that federal investigators find irresistible." This was Bumpy's masterstroke. He wasn't just defending Harlem. He was offering Costello a way to see withdrawal as strategic rather than defeated. "I'm proposing a territorial agreement," Bumpy concluded. "Mutual non-interference. Your families maintain your current operations without Harlem expansion. My organization remains north of 110th Street. No conflicts, no federal attention, no resource drain." Costello closed the folder. "And if we proceed with our original plans, then you'll discover that your information about Harlem's organization was incomplete. You'll also discover that your political protection network is more fragile than you realize. And you'll discover that sustained conflict is expensive in ways that aren't immediately obvious." It wasn't a threat. It was a business analysis. And Frank Costello, above all else, was a businessman. The conversation ended with a handshake. Not a friendship, but a recognition. Two professionals acknowledging each other's capabilities and choosing cooperation over conflict. 3 days later, the Italian families announced that they were postponing their Harlem expansion indefinitely to focus on more profitable opportunities in other boroughs. The announcement surprised every law enforcement agency in New York. They'd been preparing for a territorial war that never materialized, but what really surprised them was the intelligence that began flowing to them over the next several months. Detailed information about Italian family operations in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Information that led to dozens of arrests and the disruption of several major criminal enterprises.
The source of this intelligence was never identified, but federal investigators noticed that it only covered Italian operations outside of Manhattan north of 110th Street. Harlem remained conspicuously absent from all reports. By 1936, the Italian families had established lucrative operations in Brooklyn's docks, Queens' construction industry, and the Bronx's emerging drug trade. These operations generated more revenue with less conflict than Harlem ever could have provided. Frank Costello never admitted that Bumpy Johnson had been right, but he never attempted to expand into Harlem again either. For his part, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something remarkable. He'd protected his territory without firing a shot, defeated a superior force without engaging in battle, and established himself as a power broker on equal terms with the Italian families. The phone call became legend in New York's criminal underworld, not because of what was threatened but because of what was accomplished. Bumpy Johnson had proven that intelligence and strategy could overcome numerical and financial superiority. More importantly, he'd established a principle that would govern New York's organized crime for the next 3 decades. Harlem was off limits. Not because it couldn't be taken, but because the cost of taking it exceeded any possible benefit. This wasn't just about criminal territory, it was about respect. The Italian families had acknowledged that Bumpy Johnson was their equal, not their subordinate. In the segregated world of 1935 America, this recognition was unprecedented. But perhaps the most significant outcome was what didn't happen. Without the Italian family's expansion into Harlem, the neighborhood maintained its unique character. The community-based networks that Bumpy had described to Costello remained intact. Local businesses stayed under local control. The social fabric that held Harlem together during the Depression remained strong. Bumpy Johnson understood something that many powerful men never learn. Sometimes the greatest victory is the conflict that never happens, the war you win without fighting, the respect you earn through demonstration rather than domination. October 17, 1935. One phone call, 90 minutes of conversation, a handshake in the fog, and the entire balance of power in New York shifted without a single act of violence. That's not just crime history. That's a masterclass in strategic thinking.